I'm not a Sega fan. As a kid, all I cared about was Nintendo, and all I wanted to do was play Nintendo games. Going over to some of my friends' houses, they had Sega consoles, but I didn't care about them. They looked weird, the button layout was something I wasn't used to, and to be honest, the game just didn't look as good. I always felt like they were just lesser ports of what I was playing at home. To be fair, I was wrong about a lot of things when I was a kid, and this is just another one of those. And now that I'm older, I've tried to play Sega games multiple times and just can't get into them. I just feel like I'm always hitting the wrong button. I don't understand the layout. I just could not get it. So when I saw that Anbernic announced the ARC, I was like, alright, that's cool. You know, Sega fans are finally going to get something. And that was that. I thought it was just going to be another handheld. Well, fast forward a few days, and now I've had some time to actually play with the ARC, and I'm in love with this thing. It's an awesome handheld. I'm experiencing games that I could not get into before, and it's just been a great experience. So if you're like me and you've never really got into Sega games, or if you're somebody that grew up with them and you absolutely adore those games and you want the best way to play them, well, let's see if maybe this does it for you like it's doing it for me. We have two options for the RG ARC. One is going to be Linux only, coming in at $77.99, and the other one is going to be a dual boot with Android 11, coming in at $97.99. Both of them are going to have the Arcade 3566 as the CPU. The Linux only version has 1 GB of RAM, while the Android one has 2, and that's really going to be only for the operating system. That extra GB of RAM really isn't going to do a whole lot for extra performance. Both of them have a 640 by 480 screen, but the Android version does have a touchscreen, so that is a nice addition. The Android version has 32 GB of internal storage, while both of them are going to have a 16 GB card for the Linux operating system, and you can also expand it since it does have a dual slot. Both of them have a 3500 mAh battery, and I would have liked to see a bigger battery because other handhelds with the same chip already have bigger batteries, but even at that, you're still going to get about 6 to 4 hours of gameplay. It'll really vary depending on what system you're trying to emulate and really how hard you're going. So that's the thing with battery life with these handhelds, it's really hard to get an exact measurement. Both of them have mini HDMI out, Wi-Fi 5, and Bluetooth 4.2. So the specs really aren't anything that's going to blow you out of the water. We've seen these specs before, but it's really about the package here, not just the standalone components. I would have liked to see a more powerful CPU just so we could get better Saturn, and I would have liked to see a bigger battery. So those are just two of the big flaws that I'm seeing with this handheld. Now luckily, the rest of the package is solid, so that will compensate for that during the review process, but I can completely understand why some people would be turned off just looking at the spec sheet. Now, this is going to be one of those cases where I would strongly suggest not judging a book by its cover, so just hang around, let's talk about the handheld, and let's see what else it's doing to make up for that. So let's take a look at the device, and this is one of those cases where definitely the shell makes the handheld, because while the specs aren't impressive, it's the build quality and this D-pad that's just, it's a revelation unto itself. I'm completely converted now into this style of D-pad. It is the best thing I've used in a handheld in a very long time, and I was extremely surprised at how much I liked it, not just for, you know, the retro classic games, but I actually hooked this thing up and used it a lot as a controller. I especially loved it for Celeste. It felt like every input I was doing was precisely what I wanted it to do. I didn't really feel like I was hitting anything on accident. It's very similar to the type of experience you get when you're using a dome style D-pad, something like the Retro Pocket 3 Plus or the PS Vita, where you know exactly where you want to go and you get a tactile feedback. It's just this isn't clicky. You do get some type of feeling from it, from the rubber membranes actually pressing down, but it doesn't make any noise. It's not annoying, which is something I don't like about clicky D-pads. I don't like the constant sound. I could honestly praise this D-pad all day. I absolutely love it. I want to see this in more handhelds, but I gotta move on and talk about some other stuff too. So besides that D-pad, we do have one of the two front-facing speakers at the bottom. We have our select button up top, and there's really nothing going on the sides. On the other side, we have the next highlight, which is these 6 face buttons. Now, I've used 6-button controllers before. They're great for fighting games, but that's really all I ever used them for. There was just something kind of cool that was around. I was aware of them, but I've never really been drawn to them, even though I own one. These buttons feel really good. They have a good amount of travel. They don't go flush with the device, and they're nice and big. Now, they are a little bit louder than what I would have liked. but it's not obnoxious and you get used to them pretty fast. It's nothing like a super clicky button, they just make a noise when they hit the shell. But the layout of them is great. Everything feels like it's in the right spot, it's easily accessible, the handheld has a really good size, and no matter what type of game you're playing, this is going to work out for you. If you're playing Game Boy Advance or Game Boy games, you have your big A, B buttons right there. If you're playing Super Nintendo or PlayStation, you still have A, B, X, Y right there. So whatever style of game that you're trying to play, this is going to lend itself to that. But if you're playing something like an arcade game that's using either a 6 or a 4 button layout, then you have those buttons right there in a pattern that makes sense. That's something that always kind of got me about arcade games with the traditional 4 button layout, is that they always kind of felt like they were out of place. But I'm probably preaching to the choir here, so I'm just going to move on. We also have our bottom speaker, our start button, and the start and select buttons also have this rubber membrane kind of mushier type of feel, which again, I'm a fan of. Moving on to the bottom, we have 2 slots for our micro SD cards. The left one is going to be for our OS, and the right one's going to be to expand our storage for games. We have a hole to reset the device and our headphone jack. On the back, there's really nothing going on here. It's pretty plain. We have our Anbernic stickers and these little pronounced grips that make it a little bit more comfortable to hold. I don't hate them, I don't like them, they're just there. They're a nice addition, I guess. Moving on to the top, we have these 4 shoulder buttons, which I'm really happy to see Anbernic use stack buttons again and get away from those inline triggers that they've been using, which are just terrible. These are really good. These are just like the ones you would find on the 353P. They feel slightly easier to press if you press them from the side, but you can get actuation from them no matter what you press on them, so you're not going to have to worry about finger cramping, anything like that. I'm a big fan of these, and seriously, Anbernic, just stick to these. There's really no need to keep on using the old ones. Now, you might be wondering why there's stack buttons on this if we already have the buttons we need on the front for your Genesis games for arcade. Well, the reason for that is that this is also a really good PlayStation 1 handheld, Super Nintendo, pretty much any retro system that you want to play on this is going to be a good experience for, because the controllers are going to lend themselves to whatever type of game you want to play, as long as you don't need an analog stick. So things like Ape Escape are going to be out of the question because you just don't have sticks. But other systems, higher end systems, even like N64, you can still kind of get away with, and I'll talk about those here in a little bit. For now, let's finish our tour of the device. So for the rest of the top, we have our mini HDMI out. We have 2 USB Type-C ports, one for controllers and the other one for charging, and in case you wanted to use this as a controller, that's where you would plug it in. The function button is in a very awkward spot because it's not really easy to reach while you're holding the device. But after a little while of actually using it, I kind of got used to it, and I would just reach with my index finger and it wasn't that big of a deal. I do wish it would have been on the front or somewhere a little bit more accessible, but you know, you kind of get used to things like this, so not a huge deal. So that's going to be it for this segment. I really didn't want to spend a whole bunch of time just talking about the build and all of that, but it's doing some unique things that I felt needed to be highlighted. Up next, we're going to talk about the software. For the OS, we have Android and Linux. On the Linux side, Anbernic is using a build of Batocera that, as of right now, is the only Linux option for this handheld. Hopefully soon we'll have ArcOS and maybe Jealous, but I'm really not sure what the situation there's going to be. But for now, we're going to take a look at what we have. Starting with our standalone emulators. Now, the cool thing here is you're going to have 2 lists, one for RetroArch and one for those standalones, which makes it easier to kind of know what you're using at that moment. For Saturn emulation, this is definitely going to be the way to go. Unfortunately, Android didn't do that much better. So if you want to emulate those games, use the standalone on the Linux side. You're going to have to deal with some frame skipping, but it's going to make the games much more playable. Now moving on, next we have RetroArch, and for the RetroArch side, you pretty much just have your course right here, which you can pick from, and you can make specific changes. To do that, you would press start, go down to game settings, and here you can change things like aspect ratio, shaders, you can update your game list, all of that. Unfortunately, we don't have access to a scraper straight from this operating system, so if you do change all of your games and you want that box art, you're going to have to either take that SD card out and do it on your PC, or you're going to have to grab it and put it into something like the RGB30, pop it in there, do the screen scraping, and then take that SD card out and put it back in. Now, if you have another handheld that has either Jealous or ArcOS, that's going to work. It's kind of annoying that you have to do that, but hopefully we can see that change in the future, either with an update or with getting support from one of these other operating systems. And that's going to kind of be it for the Linux side of things. There really isn't a whole lot more to talk about here. It doesn't have a lot of features, but there is one more cool thing that I do want to mention, and that is the controller mode. So if you do want to use it as an Xbox 360 controller and plug this into your PC and use it as an external gamepad, you can definitely do that. And this is one of the few times where I would say it is actually worth it, because this is a pretty comfortable gamepad. And I'll talk more about that here in a little bit. It feels like I'm saying that a lot, I know. But right now, let's do a quick D-pad test, because I think that's really important. Because it is so easy to hit diagonals here, you would think that you're going to get a lot of false inputs, but that's really not the case. I never really felt like I was hitting the wrong angle when I was using this D-pad, and that's because there's a little bit of a feedback whenever you're pressing any of the directions. That's why I was saying earlier that this is a lot like a dome switch D-pad, where you know exactly where you're going. And you can see here, no matter how fast I move back and forward, I'm not getting any accidental inputs, but at the same time, I can easily press any of the diagonals, and that's awesome. That's ideally what a D-pad should be doing. So yeah, this D-pad is great, and now I think it's time we move on and talk a little bit about Android before we actually get into the game. So just like the Linux side, the Android side, there isn't a whole lot to talk about here. It's basically your standard Anbernic Android build, which means there's no real frills here, and you don't even get access to the Google Play Store. Now that isn't that big of a deal, because you are going to get most of these emulators already installed. There are older versions, but for our needs, they're going to be just fine. And if you do stick with these, most of them are going to be pre-configured to work with the launcher that Anbernic already gives you. So you can go ahead and update those if you want to, but I don't really think it's necessary for what I would recommend people play on here and for what I would want to play on here. Now moving on, if you go to the drop-down menu, you're going to see a couple options like key mapper. You can switch to gamepad mode. You can also access the game mode from here. So if you tap that, it's going to take us into the Anbernic launcher. And this is the same launcher we've seen Anbernic use before. It's really nothing special. It's usable. It's already pre-configured with the emulators that are pre-installed. So it's really easy to get going with it. And for the majority of the games that you would probably want to play on something like this, it's going to work just fine. Now you can go ahead and install other options yourself if you want to do that, but really, I would say for the majority of things, stick to Linux. The only time I would really go into Android at all is if I want to play an N64 game, or if I want to play something like DS or Dreamcast. And those three systems, while they work and performance isn't bad at all, aren't really the best suited for this handheld. It's because of aspect ratio and because we don't have analog sticks. Now, I will cover those here in a little bit, and I'll talk a little bit more about my experience with them. But with that, I think it's time we move on. So like I was saying, the ARC can be used as a controller, and this isn't the first time Anbernic does something like that with a handheld. The 353P had that function in it too, but it never really seemed appealing to me to do that. The buttons were just a little too small, and while the handheld is comfortable, it just wasn't as comfortable as actually using a full-size controller. But because of the size of the ARC, this actually does work. The buttons are the size of a full-size controller, and ergonomically it just feels really good. So I set it up to play some Street Fighter, some Sonic, and then I took it to Steam to play Celeste and tried some other games, and overall the experience was really good. So while I'm not saying this is going to completely replace a controller, what I am trying to say here is that if you do need a 6-button gamepad, this is going to do a great job of that. And that D-pad, man, that D-pad is really good. It's actually, for me at least, now better than what 8BitDo has. And for the longest time, that was my favorite D-pad on any controller. So that is very, very high praise for this device. You can also see that size-wise, it's actually a little bit wider than the 8BitDo Ultimate Bluetooth controller and almost as tall. So it's going to be very comfortable for longer play sessions. Now, obviously, this isn't going to be as feature-rich as an actual controller. And I'm not trying to say this is going to replace any controllers. I'm just saying if you're already going to pick this up, you have that option, and it works really good in a pinch. If you just want to play some retro games, I don't know if this would work with something like the Switch with a wired connection, but you know, it is a cool feature. So now we gotta talk about the important stuff, and that's the actual gameplay experience. And before we get into the obvious Sega systems, we've got to talk about arcade, because that is an area where this handheld absolutely shines. This 6-button layout is just perfect for arcade games, and every game that I played on here, I just enjoyed it more because of that. Except for vertical shooters, you know, we don't play those on this. You can definitely play them if you want to, but it is going to be a compromised experience. But I know some of you are crazy enough to actually want to do that, so just know that it is possible. Just map the face buttons to the D-pad and use the Z and C buttons as your 1 and 2. But more traditional games like Metal Slug or your beat 'em ups are going to work a lot better here, especially Metal Slug. I'm a huge fan of Metal Slug. That is a game that I grew up with, and that is one that I always want to load up on any handheld I have the chance to. But of course, fighting games are going to be the stars of the show here. They're going to work the absolute best on this handheld. The layout is perfect, the D-pad is perfect for them. So if you're a big fan of fighting games, this is definitely a handheld that you have to pick up and add to your collection. Of course, Genesis games are going to be a natural fit here just because of the layout of everything. And the Genesis is a library that I'm slowly discovering, and I'm really excited to get more into it. This is definitely going to be a really good way of doing that. I've also dipped into Sega CD, and I gotta be honest, on some of these games, I have no idea what's going on. I know about them, I've seen documentaries or at least videos on them. I don't know if you want to call them documentaries, but now actually trying to play them, I'm completely lost. But other games like Sonic CD just look awesome, and I'm really excited to dive into. So some of the catalog of Sega CD is probably not going to be for me, but I'm glad that I have a good way of actually experiencing those games that makes them feel a little bit more at home. Next up, we got to talk about the Sega Saturn, and this is the biggest issue that a lot of people are going to have with this handheld, and it's just that it can't do the full library of Sega Saturn. Now, to be fair, Sega Saturn is a hard system to emulate, so for most handhelds that's going to be the case, and especially in this one with the RK3566, we just don't have enough power to get full perfect Saturn emulation. Now, that being said, a lot of Saturn games are going to be completely playable, and even though you are going to have to deal with some frame skip, to be honest with you, a lot of the games that I was playing felt perfectly fine. So this is really going to have to come down to how much you want to play those games and how much the form factor of this handheld actually makes up for the lack of perfect emulation. Also, let's be honest, the Saturn was never a perfect console to begin with, so your experience may vary. For me personally, the games that I do want to try on here, I feel like this is going to be a really good way of doing that because I have that natural controller scheme that's going to lend itself to actually experiencing these games in a better way than I would have done in something that's more powerful and can run the games a little bit smoother. Now, to be fair though, there's only a limited amount of Saturn games that I actually want to try out, but hopefully the gameplay footage that I am showing kind of gives you an idea of what you can expect. Not every game is going to run great. Frame skip does help a lot and can make the games feel a little bit jumpy at times, but you know what? I don't really know any better with this console, so maybe I'm not the person to really tell you this is going to be a good Saturn machine. But I do know emulation, and I can tell you that the experience was good. It was adequate. I don't really have any complaints about it. Next up, we have Dreamcast, and that's another one that's going to be a mixed bag, but this one's also because of the controls. We just don't have an analog stick, so for some games it can be a little bit tricky. But for a lot of them, you're going to be just fine with the D-pad. This is one of those systems that I would say if you really want to try Dreamcast on here, get the Android version because I found that I was getting better performance on that side. Now, most of the games are also going to work on Linux. This is just my personal preference as to what I want to play them on and the type of performance that I want to see. So your mileage again will vary, but a lot of them are going to play just fine. Now, when you get to something like Sonic Adventure 2, you're going to have good gameplay, but the audio is going to be off. So it's just going to be one of those trial and error type things, and it's really going to come down to how bad you want to play Dreamcast on here. If that's something that you really want, I would definitely recommend a different handheld though. So that's the thing, if you're trying to go for Saturn and Dreamcast, this isn't going to be the best option. But what about the other systems? Something like Game Boy Advance, I find works really good on here because of those big A and B buttons and that awesome D-pad. You also get plenty of real estate with that 4-inch screen. So overall, Game Boy Advance, it's a really good experience. Pretty much all of the retro systems all the way up to 32-bit are going to be a good experience on this because you don't really need an analog switch for those. Now for PlayStation, there is going to be a problem with some games, a small amount of games, something like Ape Escape, like I said before, just isn't going to work because we don't have analog sticks. But overall, the PlayStation 1 experience is solid. You have all of the right inputs, you have all of the right shoulder buttons, everything's there. And most PlayStation 1 games were meant for D-pad input anyway, so it just works. So the last system I'm going to talk about here is going to be N64 because that one was a big surprise for me. I was really not expecting to play as much N64 as I actually ended up playing on the ARC because obviously you don't have an analog stick, so it really shouldn't work. But somehow the D-pad and the 6 face buttons just make up for that, and it's actually a pretty good experience. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect, but I did play through the Deku Tree in Ocarina of Time. I got a couple stars in Super Mario 64. I played a level of 007, I played some Conker's Bad Fur Day, and overall, I had a really good time doing it. There was a couple issues here and there just with some of the finer controls with like Super Mario, where I had to kind of adjust things, but overall, I didn't really have anything that would consider game breaking. The layout is almost perfect for N64 with 6 face buttons and enough shoulder buttons to make up for the rest. This is the only time that I kind of wish we had an analog stick, but at the same time I don't, because that would have really ruined the aesthetics of this handheld. It would have probably made it a little bit more usable for some of these systems, but like I said, I had a good time playing N64. Now, I can't say that every single game is going to be a good time, because obviously I haven't had it long enough to really test out every single N64 game, but my usual ones that I like to play, I didn't really have any problems with. So I'm kind of in an awkward spot here, because I don't want to say I would recommend this for N64, but at the same time, I had such a good time playing it that I can't say that I wouldn't. So with all that being said, we kind of come to the end of the video, and the big question is, do I recommend the ARC? And the short answer is yes, of course. The long answer is it really depends on who you are. So if you're somebody that just wants to get one handheld and you want to be able to play as much as possible, no, don't get this handheld. It's going to be limited for the higher end systems, and you're just not going to be able to get as much out of it as you would out of something like a Retro Pocket 3 or a 405M or any of those handhelds that have more power and have more complete controls. By complete controls, I mean basically you have sticks. But if you're somebody that really prioritizes those older classic systems that use pretty much just a D-pad or arcade games, then yeah, this is definitely going to be the best handheld to play those games on. I can't really think of any other handheld that's out in recent years that offers a better experience for arcade, for Sega games, for just classic retro games than what the ARC has. And even though those other handhelds are more powerful, can play more systems, and are a very value all around for somebody that just wants the one system to play as much as possible, none of those handhelds actually made me want to go back and try out Sega games. None of those handhelds made me want to really pick up and play fighting games again. So that to me means a lot, and I'm sure a lot of you that grew up with Sega systems, that grew up playing those fighting games, are really going to be able to appreciate what this handheld has to offer, even though it's not perfect and it could be more powerful. So if you made it this far into the video, let me just say thank you. I know as adults we're really busy and we don't always have 25 minutes to listen to some guy talk about a handheld. So it means a lot to me that you decided to spend that time listening to me. So hopefully I didn't ramble on too much. If you liked the video, leave a like. If you haven't subscribed, please don't forget to subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. It helps us be able to reach more people and get YouTube to kind of share what we're doing a little bit more. So we'd really appreciate it. That's going to be all for today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.